Hey there, my name is Brian, welcome to my channel. In this video, I want to talk about racism in literature and how we can confront it. Specifically, I want to talk about the racism of H.P. Lovecraft, his legacy, and how we can confront both his work and his legacy in an actively anti-racist way. To do this, I'm going to use as an example award-winning author N.K. Jemison's latest book, The City We Became, which you can buy now. So The City We Became depicts a metropolis under attack by a malevolent, infectious invader, aided and abetted by the stubborn fears and self-defeating prejudices of those who mistrust the city's polyglot nature. That's from Slate.com. But before we dive in, I want to address the question of why I, a white person, am talking about race right now. So let's get into it. Racism is systemic in our country. You can see that in the prison industrial complex. You can see that in the education system. You can see that in the police state. Police brutality is one example that is at the front of everyone's minds right now after the murder of George Floyd and the public outcry that has resulted around the world. The thing about living in a systemically racist society is that standing on the sidelines isn't really an option. It isn't enough to not be racist, as if that's some sort of moral washing of the hands of this whole situation. As someone who has benefited from systemic racism, which is to say, as a white person in America, it is my duty to be actively anti-racist. Now, the thing about anti-racism, as opposed to not being racist, is that anti-racism is a positive identity that requires action towards the solution instead of pretending to not be part of the problem. I've linked to a really good T1J video down below where he talks about how it's more useful to look at racist as an adjective than as a noun. You know, it's more useful to talk about how a system is racist or how an action is racist than it is to just say, that person's a racist. He's careful, though, to say that it's still good to call out racist people for being racist. He also points out that it's almost impossible for a white person to live in America without actively contributing towards systemic racism. So in addition to supporting Black Lives Matter and contributing to bail funds for protesters and amplifying Black voices and buying from Black creators and supporting Black-owned businesses and defunding the police, we as anti-racists also have a duty to educate ourselves. I think the framing of that is very important. We have a duty to educate ourselves, not to go get educated by other people. So in this video, I want to try to educate myself. I want to be clear that I'm not holding myself up as an authority on racism or the Black Lives Matter movement or the defund the police movement. What I'm hoping to model is a way to think critically about the media that I am consuming in an actively anti-racist way. In addition, I would encourage everyone to apply the same level of criticism towards the systems that we participate in, whether that's the education system or the housing market or the prison industrial complex. We need to be asking how these systems perpetuate racial inequality and what can be done to change that. I would also like to point out that just because you or I might be new to this fight doesn't mean that this fight is new. You know, for example, the defund the police movement is popular right now, but it's been grounded in the work of, people like Angela Davis who have been working since the 60s. So listen to experts. If you didn't know, H.P. Lovecraft was a horror writer writing in the early 20th century who helped define the horror and fantasy genres, specifically cosmic horror. And his influence can be seen all over. He was also a huge racist, and his racism played a huge influence in the work that he created. And considering the size and the scope of his influence on the horror and fantasy genres, we then have to consider how his racism has seeped into those genres. See, this is how Lovecraft relates to those systems that we were talking about earlier. It's more than just he individually was a racist. He helps create and perpetuate narratives that are racist. It's more than just public policy that contributes to systemic racism. We also have to look into the narratives that are being perpetuated both in the media and in the content that we consume. A perfect example of how racism has embedded itself into the fantasy and horror genres is with Dungeons and Dragons. People have pointed out that orcs and dark elves, which are usually depicted as evil in Dungeons and Dragons, have been linked to racist depictions of certain ethnic groups in a way that's problematic. Now, I'm not saying that any of the issues within Dungeons and Dragons are directly related to H.P. Lovecraft, but it's good to see how important it is that we critically examine the media that we are consuming. Sarah Zed made a video very recently in a similar vein regarding J.K. Rowling and her transphobia, specifically regarding how her transphobia impacts her work. It's a pretty long video, but it's well worth the watch, so I'll link it. Now, while there are similarities between Lovecraft's racism and J.K. Rowling's transphobia, I think there are a few key differences. First of all, Lovecraft's racism is much more pervasive throughout his work than Rowling's transphobia is in her work. Also, Lovecraft has been dead for a long time. This is important for a few reasons. With Rowling, you have to ask the question, can I justify giving her money? You don't have to ask that question with Lovecraft, because he's dead. Since he wrote such a long time ago, his work has had a chance to spread and influence a lot of more subsequent work. There's also the added bonus that his stuff is now in the public domain, so we can do more with it than we could with Rowling's work. So as a result, there are more options available to a horror fan who's struggling with the ramifications of Lovecraft's racism than there are to a Harry Potter fan who is struggling with the ramifications of Rowling's transphobia. So you love horror. Maybe you love Lovecraft. How do you handle his racism? I think there are a few options available. So option one is we can just not read him. There are plenty of horror writers available, plenty who have written lots of good stuff, who also aren't racist, and we can just read those authors. If you're looking for a recommendation, I would definitely check out the work of Caitlin Kiernan, who's writing right now, and she has some great stuff. The issue with just not reading Lovecraft is that there's more to take into account than just his body of work. Like, sure, you can just stop reading him, but his influence spreads wider. For example, until very recently, the World Fantasy Award came with a bust of H.P. Lovecraft. So if you won, you'd get to keep this creepy, half-melted Oscar-looking thing if Oscar was an ugly racist. So if just not reading Lovecraft isn't enough, what else can we do? Another option, I guess, is we could remove the racism. There are a few problems with that, though. First of all, a lot of his work is just all racism. Like, if you remove the racism from the horror at Red Hook, you just wouldn't have the horror at Red Hook anymore. It's all racism. A lot of the horror in his writing is based on his real personal hatred of immigrants and cities and non-Euclidean geometry. I'm not really sure what that one has to do with anything. And there's just something disingenuous about essentially pretending that Lovecraft wasn't racist. Ignoring racism or pretending it's not there can't be the solution. So I think the best option for tackling the legacy of Lovecraft is to subvert it. What if we used Lovecraft's legacy in a way that he would have hated? What if we use his IP to be actively anti-racist? This is exactly what N.K. Jemisin does in her book, The City We Became. So in this book, cities come alive and they're embodied by these avatars, which are real people, but also these physical manifestations of the personality of the city. The City We Became centers on these 6 avatars of New York City. They're the 5 boroughs and then one for all of New York City as a whole. And these avatars have to team up to fight this mysterious otherworldly force, which is sort of similar to Lovecraft's Great Old Ones, like Cthulhu. And this power is embodied by a woman in white who tries to manipulate each of the avatars into joining her side. Now, in interviews, Jemisin points out that some of the language that he uses to describe the Great Old Ones is similar to the language that he uses in personal letters to describe immigrants in New York City. This is just a further example of how his racism influences his writing. In another interview, Jemison said she wasn't even a huge fan of Lovecraft. She just wanted to write this book to engage with the ideas of his legacy. I find myself in a similar position in that I'm sort of adjacently familiar with his work. That being said, I did read The Horror at Red Hook in preparation for this video. It seems like this is the story that Jemison is most closely responding to. So in summary, The Horror at Red Hook is the story of how this police officer finds this cult of child-stealing, devil-worshipping foreigners in Brooklyn. The story is filled with racist language, and honestly, it's pretty bad. Like, it requires the reader to be horrified at the idea of foreigners in order for it to work. As a result, the story isn't really effective in being horrifying or that interesting other than as a case study of Lovecraft's racism. So to return to The City We Became, what Jemison does in response to Lovecraft and Red Hook is she takes the things that he uses as ingredients for horror and she makes them the foundation of power and a cause for celebration. And to sort of complete the subversion, she also takes the point of view that the main character in Red Hook has and makes it the object of horror in The City We Became. So in Red Hook, you have racism being the reason that the main character is horrified, whereas in The City We Became, you have racism as the object of horror. So let's take a look at how she uses power and diversity, and then at how she uses racism as horror. The first thing to note is that the heroes of the story are all people of color. Now, this isn't itself a radical act, or at least it shouldn't be, considering that people of color make up the majority of the population of New York City, so a group of avatars that represent New York City would, just playing the odds, most likely be a group of people of color. However, since this is a fantasy story and one steeped in the lore of Lovecraft, it is noticeable and a little radical to have people of color be the heroes. I mean, just take a look at most mainstream fantasy and you'll see that light equals good, dark equals bad. If you're now drawing a connection between the fact that the fantasy genre is pretty whitewashed and at least one huge racist had an outsized impact on that genre, these are the sort of connections that we should be making. So Bronca is the avatar of the Bronx, and she's this elderly Lenape art director who was part of the Stonewall riots and the American Indian movement in the 60s. And I wanted to read a passage describing her past because it's just so good. Out of nowhere, Bronca finds herself remembering a day from her childhood. She'd borrowed, her father's steel-toed construction worker boots so that she could walk through a brick yard on her way to do errands. She'd decided to cut through it to avoid some of the neighborhood boys whose catcalling and attempts to follow her had lately shifted from speculation into an active hunt. There'd been one man, they were all grown men, and she was all of 11 years old, who moonlighted as a security guard and who'd been especially persistent. Rumor had it that he'd washed out of being a cop somehow, something involving improper behavior with an underage witness. Rumor also had it that he liked Hispanic girls, and nobody around the Bronx could keep it straight that Bronca was something else. So when she'd seen this man step out of the crumbling entryway of an old building shell, with a smirk on his lips and his hand prominently resting on the handle of his gun, she'd felt like she does now, 50-ish years later in an art center bathroom. She'd felt bigger, beyond fear or anger. She'd gone to the doorway, of course. Then she grabbed its sides to brace herself and kicked in his knee. He'd spent 3 months in traction, claiming he'd slipped on a brick and never messed with her again. 6 years later, having bought her own pair of steel-toed boots, Bronca had done the same thing to a police informant at Stonewall. Another time she'd been part of something bigger. Bronca moves forward with a purpose, with her fists clenched and a grin on her lips because in spite of herself she's always loved a good rumble. Even if it's the 21st century and nobody calls it a rumble anymore. Even if she's gotten old and respectable, she's still Bronca from the brickyards, Bronca the scourge of Stonewall, Bronca who faced down armed police alongside her brothers and sisters in AIM. It's kind of a dance, see? Every battle is a dance. She was always a good dancer at the powwows, and these days, the steel-toed boots dwell permanently in her soul. So Jemison takes Bronca a character that Lovecraft would have been horrified by, and she makes her this powerhouse. It's really cool. What I love about this adaptation of Lovecraft is not only does it poke holes at Lovecraft's racism by showing stories from the perspective of people that he would have been horrified by, but by comparing their perspectives with a perspective similar to Lovecraft's, which we'll get to in a second, you get to see how pathetic and how scared and how small Lovecraft was. Like, if you had a version of the horror at Red Hook told from the perspective of someone who wasn't a racist, not only would it not be a horror story, you'd also get to see how pathetic Lovecraft's view of the world is. So the character who most closely resembles Lovecraft's outlook is Eileen Houlihan, who's the avatar for Staten Island. She's this person who's never left Staten Island, who lives at home and has never really had a job despite being at least 30. And, well, to be frank, she's a huge racist who's scared of everything that moves. We first meet her as she's trying to board the ferry to go to Manhattan, but she has a panic attack when she's in a crowd and a black man brushes up against her. This is a passage from after the panic attack when she's met the woman in white who's trying to manipulate her. Her eyes catch on the strange woman who's still standing there with a hand on Eileen's shoulder. Eileen can barely feel the hand. Her nerves don't seem to register its weight or the warmth that should be there. By contrast, her other arm, the one grabbed by the black man on the ferry ramp, still tingles. Did he do something to her? Were there maybe drugs on his hands, and they are seeping through her skin? Her father has warned her that some drugs work this way. So by contrasting Eileen's perspective with the rest of the avatars, you get to see how pathetic her perspective, and by extension how pathetic Lovecraft's perspective really is. They're both horrified at New York City for the same reason. It's full of people who don't look like them. Now, this book came out in early 2020 and was written probably at least a year before that, but there's one scene that's really reminiscent of this Amy Cooper-like encounter where this white woman threatens to call the cops on the avatar of Manhattan, and all he's doing is just standing in a park. Now, all of these people are being influenced by the woman in white in the same way that she's able to influence Eileen, but Jemison makes it really clear that she's not making these people racist. She's just playing on their racism to get at what she wants. Now, there's one particular example that I want to focus on, and it's where this group of white dude bros called the Alt Artistes show up at Branca's art center with this art installation. Most of their art is bad, both because it lacks skill and because it's just super racist. And the whole reason that they're bringing the art to Branca's art center is so that they can then go and make YouTube videos about how, you know, they're the victims of reverse racism or something. But there's one piece that they bring that was probably created by the woman in white, and it shows New York City from Lovecraft's perspective, which allows Jemison to dunk on Lovecraft some more and also take a dig at people who uncritically consume and reproduce Lovecraft's work. This is also where we sort of see a thesis statement for the book. Branca says,
I could see it if you were trying to turn a mirror on Lovecraft, show how twisted his fears and hatreds were. But this painting reinforces them. This shows you New York as he saw it, the chicken shit little fuck, walking down the street and imagining that every other human being he met wasn't human. So, gentlemen, again, what part of we don't do bigotry do you not understand?
So in The City We Became, Jemison takes the people who are seen as objects of horror in Lovecraft's stories and makes them the heroes of her own work, while exposing the viewpoint of Lovecraft's narrators as small and racist. But what Jemison is doing here is actually demonstrating how the people who view everyone who's different than them as dangerous actually become the monsters that they're afraid of. And these monsters prey on people who, because of their identities, are placed under systems of oppression. It seems to me that what Jemison has done is exactly the way to use Lovecraft's work against him. This is exactly the way to deal with his legacy. Now, I know this is a heavier topic than ones I've covered before. I want to thank you for sticking through this probably a bit longer video. Thanks for watching.